Welcome to Young Adults Learning Evil, hosted by Nirule. Young Adults Learning Evil is a gritty documentary podcast that explores the intersectionality of class, wealth, and race, and how it has played out over the past 400 years within a community. The podcast gives the world insight into how urban trauma affects a marginalized Black community inside one of America's first planned cities, New Haven, Connecticut. New Haven is also the home of one of the world's most prestigious and powerful institutions, Yale University. Subscribe to Young Adults Learning Evil on your favorite podcast platform. Here is your host, Nirule.
Peace. I'm your host, Nirule, and this is Young Adults Learning Evil. In this episode, we will discuss the history of human trafficking and torture in the New Haven colony. We will also discuss the transition from being African hostages to citizens under systemic oppression. So the name of this episode will be called Hostages, Crime in the New Haven Colony. Connecticut was a key site for people when they want to study human trafficking in New England because it had a mix of urban centers, had small ports, and they also had like frontier farms. And because of the evidence that was left behind, it was able to look into like the different conflicts they had with the Native Americans, the foreign accounts they had when they were human trafficking, and the different legal changes that were going on inside of the colony. So you can get a real good comprehensive look at New Haven from the beginning up till now, because there have been very good and meticulous records that still survive till this day. Held mostly by ministers, doctors, and the merchant elite, hostages in the North often perform household duties in addition to skilled jobs. So they worked as carpenters, shipwrights, sailmakers, printers, tailors, shoemakers, coopers, blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, and goldsmiths. And many became so talented in the crafts that the free white workers, they lost their jobs to them. And that would cause like a lot of resentment within the community. And these African and these hostages were skilled, all they had to have was that opportunity to do that, and they would show their talent based off their drive, their ability to learn quickly, and their creativity. Eventually they was able to buy their freedom in some instances, and then make a living for themselves. So New Haven first governor was Theophilus Eaton, and he was a human trafficker and a merchant. He had 3 hostages when he came to New Haven: John and Lucretia Cram and Nigger Anthony. And that's his name. That's what it says on the paper, Nigger Anthony. So since 1630s, that's how we call him my nigga. That was my nigga Anthony. That's what that was. So, these are cultural things that, is historical significance to them. So, along with Theophilus Eaton, John Davenport, who was a Puritan reverend and also a human trafficker, came as a partnership. So, they had the business side and the spiritual side. And they came as a team, and New Haven was like their Puritan utopia that they came with their hostages with them. So when you're looking at the culture of human trafficking in New England, especially in the context of a Puritan society, they seen the African hostages as having a place in their social order. They were forced to attend the same congregational churches as the human traffickers, and usually having to sit in their own section, but they had to worship with the families that held them hostage. Historians like to describe human trafficking in the North as paternalistic, with the hostages being treated as irresponsible junior family members, or on some occasions nearly as equals. But I kind of think that, maybe in some cases, but at the end of the day, they were human trafficking, and they kept the person as hostage. They weren't free to go. So how equal did they see them as if they held them as a hostage? In Connecticut, they abolished human trafficking before the Revolutionary War. It was only the importation of humans. There still was an internal trade of human trafficking. And the purpose of the abolition of human trafficking was more political, because Connecticut wanted to deprive England of a source of profit, and it was a blow for their own freedom. The Connecticut merchants weren't very heavily involved in human trafficking like some in Boston and in Newport, Rhode Island. So the state of Connecticut could afford to end it. And the humanitarian or the good feeling part of it, that was definitely a secondary motivation. The first one was to punish England. So that is the beginning of New Haven Colony. During this time, they created rules and laws to govern the colonies. And within those rules and laws were black codes. Discrimination against free blacks was more severe in Connecticut than in any other New England colony. The Black Codes was America's first form of systemic oppression against its African hostages and free black people. Discrimination against free blacks was more severe in Connecticut than in any other New England colony. Their lives were strongly restricted by laws, even before they became numerous. It also forbid black hostages to wander beyond the city limits of the town or places where they belong without a ticket or a pass from a human trafficker or the authorities. And that makes me think about, in the present day, the Southampton line is heavily policed. So when you cross it, they'll profile you and check and see if you got your license, your registration. So that's the modern day custom to something that started in the 1600s. But that's just the way that the relationships between the races has always been, and it's just an unspoken law at this point. A law of 1708, citing frequent fights between African hostages and whites, imposed a minimum penalty of 30 lashes on an African hostage who disturbed the peace or who attempted to strike a white person. Even speech was subject to control. By 1730, there was a law saying that any black, Native American, or biracial hostages who spoke or wrote about any white person words which could be actionable if they were uttered by a free white person, which means something that if a free white person said, they could actually do it. Upon the conviction inside of a court, they were to be tortured and whipped with 40 lashes. In 1717, the General Assembly prohibited throughout the whole colony free blacks from even retroactively owning any land or going to business without the permission of a selectman or somebody that's a politician. So you gotta get, at one point in time, even if you had money, you had the means, they just wasn't even allowing it. That's systemic racism. That's how the wealth gap became what it is. Because even if we had the opportunity and the means, we're not even slaves, we're not even hostages no more, you free. They denied that opportunity to you. And in order to even get land, there'll be a lot of different factors going against you. What is also important is the historical factor is that the credibility of the witness. Now, by law, in most southern states and many northern states, an African hostage could not testify against a white man, even for himself. As for example, in the state of New York, Ohio, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, and Indiana, you can have at least 12, sometimes more than 12 African hostages or black freemen to say against what one white person say, and it still doesn't outweigh it. So that didn't only happen in the southern states. That was a cultural practice amongst the whole country. And it cannot be doubted that a lot of these historical factors have a very decided influence in the cases of black people in our criminal punishment system that we have in America today. So another historical factor that relates to the crime for which African hostages or free black men may be arrested, as far as speech, there was a historical factor that relates to the crimes for which African hostages may be arrested. Now, historically, any word or protest against a white man by an African hostage or a freeman was considered disrespectful or disorderly conduct, and it was a serious crime for an African hostage or a free black man to strike or even to presume that they're going to strike a white person. But a white man was at the same time simply exercising his right as a member of a superior caste in abusing an African hostage or black freeman. And he could strike them with impunity. But some laws prohibited maiming and killing. So in some instances in New Haven and in Connecticut, an African hostage could sue and get damages from their human trafficker if they were injured or maimed by them being abused. But at the same time, it's lawful for them to be abused. So they're saying it's moderate abuse, I guess, but that still is foul either way. And a hostage is able to take the human traffickers to court for abuse, and some of them have been successful in winning their cases in New Haven. But at the same time, a box to the ears was no crime when given by a white to a black freeman or African hostage. But the reverse was punishable by torture. So that's why it doesn't balance out. It doesn't make sense. So you can get damages if they abuse you to the point where they maim you or you can't work, but they could just beat on you until that point. It doesn't really seem like there's much of a difference between the North and the South. It's the same people, same families, just a little bit different cultures. It was the same goal. It was white supremacy. This makes me think of an event that happened recently in New Haven where protesters, they clashed over the removal of the Columbus statue, and a white man attacked an indigenous man, but the police only confronted the victim like he was the one that committed the crime. So it's still part of it's embedded in the culture. It's embedded in the culture. So even if they do attack us first, it's almost like we deserve it. But if we were to be the aggressor or to even retaliate, we are the first ones to get arrested and accosted by the police. This is historical. You know, this ain't just something that just happened or just happened because of the Democrats or whatever that I hear some right-wing people or right-wing minded people saying this is something that's been embedded within this society. Because if it's something that's been done 300 years ago and you still see evidence of it heavily to this day, what conclusion can you come to? Crime and torture in New Haven has been unequal since the founding of the colony. Like I said, ever since the beginning. Now, I'm going to tell you the story about George Spencer. George Spencer was the first non-native that was executed in New Haven. So the first court case that went into execution, and it wasn't a Native American because they was going to war with them, it was a black man named George Spencer. Now, George Spencer was a character. You know, when you seen him and you heard him, you remember him. He was a big black man. He was strong, real gruffy face, had one white eye, might have been a cataract, might have been something from abuse, but he just had that one white eye and he had one regular eye. And he was mean. He was known to be argumentative. He was known to curse. They said he was blasphemous. And that made the human traffickers and the other white people in the area see him as a threat. On the farm of one of George's former employers, a pig was born. Out of all the litter, this one pig had one eye. It was deformed, and the one eye was a white eye, and it lived for a few minutes and then it died. This farmer decided to call the authorities and said that George Spencer committed bestiality, had sex with his pig, and the baby died. The authorities arrested George, and George denied it over and over again because it was nonsense. Like, why would you even look at me like that? But you understand how the way they viewed African hostages was as animals. So they really thought that was a plausible thing to say. So he denied it, but they kept on threatening him, and it was threatening him. And then he was like, okay, I did it. As long as you don't beat me or torture me anymore, I'll say I did it. So they used that confession against him, even though he vehemently denied it. But they said he will be spared. And they brought him in front of a jury and they sentenced him to death. And that was the first non-Native American executed in the New Haven colony. And it was a black man that was framed for a nonsense crime. The Connecticut colony always had this adversarial relationship with independent and free black men, because a lot of them would come from outside of the colony and they would have a certain type of attitude that wasn't conducive to the regular Puritan conservative values that they had in the Northeast and New Haven. So when we're looking at one of the main things that they used to demonize African hostages and free black men was always sex crimes. They always used that as a way to demonize and criminalize us and frame us. So even though these allegations won't be true, and this is historical, you can look at history. For example, Rosewood. So between Rosewood and Emmett Till, those are the prime examples of how this has been always a legacy that they've used to demonize African hostages and free black men in America. In New Haven, the only two people that were executed for rape were black men whose guilty verdict was very questionable. The first one was Negro Cuff, or Negro Cuffy. Negro Cuffy was a hostage of a militia soldier who was charged with raping a 15-year-old girl in East Haven while he was walking down the street. He denied the crime and pled not guilty. His attorneys argued about the veracity of the witnesses' statements. The jury sentenced him to death by hanging, and this was in 1749. There was no clear evidence of a rape. It was a he said, she said situation. And as I said earlier about the credibility of witnesses, so that black code about the credibility of black witnesses is always used against us, and that's how they was able to get him sentenced for death. Even if he's telling the truth, even if there's no evidence, if that's what the white witnesses say, that's what the court is going to believe. Now, the next story that I'm going to tell you is a little bit more well known, and I'm going to unwrap this character at another time. But I'm going to give you the short version of his story, because it's very, very interesting. I'm going to let you know the significance of his story. So I'm going to tell you about Joseph Mountain. He was born as an African hostage in Philadelphia around 1758. And while he grew older, he went to a Quaker school. And they believed in a lot of equality. So they made Philadelphia into a more of a progressive city, probably the most progressive in the country as far as for African American and abolitionism. So the Quaker school that he was taught at, he really realized he couldn't be the person that he wanted to be in America. And he studied and he heard about the Somerset decision that basically outlawed slavery in Britain and its colonies. So this is around close to the Revolutionary War. He joined a boat crew and sailed first to London, where he joined the street gang and a robbery crew, where he would do con jobs, stick-ups, and rob aristocrats. And while he was in London, he also married a white woman. Inside the integrated society, it brought joy to Joseph. All the poor Londoners, they were all on the same level, playing the field. If there was work, they went and did work. If there wasn't no work, they all committed crimes. But this was the culture. And while in Britain, Joseph Mountain, he participated in the Gordon riots. And that was in about 1780. So 4 years after America's independence. He was a part of the surging interracial crowds that destroyed elite property and liberated prisoners until the military came out and suppressed them. So he was out there like getting it in. So he was doing everything, just enjoying a whole different type of lifestyle that he couldn't see himself doing in America. And while he was there, he was able to travel too. So he got on a boat and he went to like Portugal, like Lisbon and Gibraltar, and to Venice and Italy. Then he went around to Africa, to the West African coast, and then down to Jamaica, Grenada, even back to Philly. He went to New York, Boston, checked out Greenland, and then he went back to London. Because he's like, I'm not messing with America right now. But that was like that up until 1790, when he finally returned back home. He landed initially, I believe, I'm not sure, between Boston and Hartford. And he was traveling to New York City. He thought he was thugging, so when he was in Hartford on the Connecticut River, he rented a boat and stole $5. But he was immediately caught after that. and was tortured for it. Once they let him go, he was upset. He only had a few more dollars to his pockets. So he walked to New Haven and he linked up with some more free black men and he got drunk. After he got drunk, he kept his way moving to New York. While he's walking, he sees some young girls. He tried to talk to them and he didn't like the response. And he grabbed one of the girls and the girl pushed him off and he screamed and he went away. And then they told the people at home and they came out and they all just like surrounded him and started yelling at him until the police came. And when the police came, they locked him up, they shackled him, they brought him to the jail and they said, "Hey, you raped her." He's like, "Nah, I didn't rape her. I wanted to talk to her. She was being rude and so I grabbed her. You know what I'm saying? I did assault her, if you want to say that, but I definitely didn't rape her." It was David Daggett that was going to be the prosecutor to try the case against him. He pleaded not guilty, but 11 witnesses, including the teenage sisters, testified against Joe Mountain. He was sentenced for execution in October. While awaiting execution, David Daggett took the liberty to attempt to befriend Joseph Mountain. And in that attempt, he started to write a book, trying to get a confessional out of him. He would write to the General Assembly and say that even if the case was for rape, rape is not a capital punishment. The other alternatives were to be castrated, locked up in Newgate prison, or to be sold abroad, so to continue the human trafficking, which was interesting. But while he was petitioning the General Assembly, David Daggett had his own ulterior motives. He was writing his book. He was listening to Joe Mountain's story, and he would put in his embellishments, and he would say what he wanted the people to hear. And all the while, they are putting ads in the papers as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, promoting people to come see the hanging of Joseph Mountain, the African hostage who became a British sailor. It was a spectacle. The General Assembly denied Joseph Mountain's grievances, and his scheduled execution came. It was well attended. People from far away and near came to see the execution of Joseph Mountain. And at that execution, David Daggett was selling the first popular propaganda that promoted the black male rapist. The book was something that sounded like a Tucker Carlson monologue about young black men, and especially young black men that come from a culture that they resent. So he painted a picture that demonized this black man and highlighted the rape, even though he denied it, even though there's not real heavy evidence, but we know how the black codes work regardless of what the evidence says. If there are white witnesses that say the contrary, that's where the law follows. So when he's executed, people go back home with these books and they circulate in their communities. And they circulate and they circulate. And that book at that era was the most printed, most read. It was translated into different languages and it promoted this negative stereotype of black men. And this is 1790. And we still see the media doing that till this day. Because that's how systemic racism and oppression is perpetuated. The newly emerging and popular genre of sensational crime literature, it became the most popular criminal confession story of that era. David Daggett became famous after treating Joseph Mountain like the Central Park Five. After that, he founded the Yale Law School. He also served as mayor of New Haven, and his family has a street named after themselves in the Hill neighborhood. In 1830, rape was no longer considered a capital punishment in Connecticut. But from the beginning of the colony up until 1830, the court sentenced 11 men to hang for the crime. 7 were black, 4 were white. And of those 11, 5, which were 2 blacks and 3 whites, had their death sentences commuted the way Joe Mountain wanted for himself. And the officials hanged 6 men, which were 5 blacks and 1 white, Joseph Mountain and Negro Cuffey included. Throughout the entire period, the African American population was minimal. Yet, more than 80% of those executed were for rape. Throughout the entire period, the African American population was minimal. Yet, more than 80% of those executed for rape were black. And as you see, New Haven is where the myth of the black rapist became a legend. Now, free Africans were more likely to be imprisoned than the African hostages. 1/3 of Newgate Prison, which is Connecticut's oldest prison, which held a lot of hostages from different wars and Native Americans from when they're fighting them, it also held a lot of free black men. 1/3 of Newgate Prison population was black, although blacks were only 1/28 of the state population. So this is nothing new. This has been from the first prison until now. So it's all by design. It's systemic racism, systemic criminalization. They criminalize poverty. All these different things have been perpetuated ever since the beginning of this country. So we have to look at everything differently. And some institutions need to be reformatted because 4 out of the 5 black convicts were male. So they were criminalizing the black male. And that's been from the beginning. Some writers of the period suggested that blacks, quote unquote, evil propensities that were rooted in inherent desire and innate defiance. So they try to say that us not obeying the white rule made us evil. Like I said, evil is relative. Some other writers of the time, they claimed that black crime stemmed from the environmental factors, which is the same thing as today. And this is people saying this 300 years ago, because there are only certain type of factors that will cause someone to commit crime. Once those risk factors are alleviated, the people are less likely to commit crime. We're not saying they won't commit any crime, but they will be less likely to do so. So the Revolutionary War made a big change in New Haven. There was already a call for the ending of slavery. And the Revolutionary War gave a lot of people that opportunity. Service in the army was often a way for African hostages to achieve freedom. The British, in a bid to weaken America, offered African hostages freedom if they fought for them. Many African hostages escaped their human traffickers and picked up arms against the British. Some African hostages were freed by patriotic masters just to serve. And some hostages, they served in place of their human traffickers, with freedom as their reward at the end of their enlistment. And then you had some hostages that just used their enlistment bounty to buy their own freedom. Everyone had these different motives. Because then you also had some African hostages who just went to fight with no promise of freedom at all. They just wanted to be out there and fight and shoot guns, and I'm pretty sure they just were delighted to kill people that have been abusive to them, and they just jumped at the opportunity. And then you also had the adventure and the bounty of the war, which had many free blacks and whites as well joining into the army and enlisting, because bounty was like riches and land that they were taking from the British government. So if they were to win something, they would gain things, and those were things of value. But only the people that were able to participate and have full rights at that time were able to capitalize off of it. So a lot of the benefits that families got at that time helped them establish the wealth that they're still living with today. So these are the different roots still of systemic oppression. In New Haven, a lot of the Black Revolutionary War soldiers were part of David Humphrey's company of colored troops. And after service, when they came back to New Haven, and still some of their family wasn't free, even though some of them fought for their own freedom. So they gathered and they petitioned for the freedom of their families. So enough African hostages and now newly free black men made enough noise so that they created the Gradual Manumission Act, which freed all the children of slaves born after 1784. After they turned 25. But they didn't like that. The black people weren't satisfied with that at all. So they got it lowered to 21. So that's the type of determination and tenacity that the black community had in New Haven and in the Connecticut colony. And this is at the beginning of the country. This is the 1780s. America is not even 10 years old yet. And black people have been protesting and fighting for their rights. And winning some. These are small victories, but relative, they're huge. So emancipated black men and women that escaped enslavement, they made up the community of free black people in New Haven. They were still subjected to the black codes, but they had their own. Freed and enslaved blacks, they commingled in the city because all the accommodations they were segregated. And New Haven had always tried to integrate the neighborhoods but just segregate the facilities. Black neighborhoods were created during colonial periods but became established during the federal era, and they were moved at the whim of a government. So whenever they felt like they want to make a change here and we want to develop here and move this neighborhood, they did it. So when you look at historical events like the Urban Renewal Project, that is something that they have continuously practiced in the New Haven area on smaller scales. So the Urban Renewal was a large scale version of a political landscape project that they've always had, and a practice that they've always been doing since the beginning of the colony. The early black neighborhoods that were found in New Haven were Poverty Square, which is the area around Whaley, Sperry, and Gore Street. Negro Lane, which is State Street East, by the FBI building going towards the bridge. And then you had New Guinea, which is the Wooster Square area up to Franklin Street and Green Street. That little area right there was called New Guinea, and you had New Liberia also. That is the end of the episode of Hostages, Crime, and the New Haven Colony. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to talk about. So join the Facebook group, start the conversation. Follow me on all social media platforms, Young Adults Learning Evil. Check us out on www.youngadultslearningevil.com. Peace.
Thank you for listening to Young Adults Learning Evil. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Visit our Patreon page and learn how you can support and stay in tune with the movement. Till next time, peace.